The creature had several appendages unfamiliar to the man, but many of them resembled trunks or largely thick tails. These lashed out like heavy clubs as it tried to fight its captors, darting side to side in sluggish leaps. It seemed unsteady as it flailed and stumbled about. The armed figures moved with tactical skill in sharp contrast to the beast, and it failed to land a single blow on them as they danced around it. Out of its pod, the beast's screams were audible of the murmur of the crowd as it seemed to squeal and grunt in random, choppy outbursts. It tired quickly as it flailed, and finally came to a stop, heaving in ragged breaths. It slowly turned, trying to keep the two figures in sight. Apparently, those figures had simply been trying to get in range, because the strange engagement ended abruptly. A loud crack ripped out as the beast was promptly zapped with a ball of light from the end of one of the metal rods. The beast fell to the floor in an instant and was dragged away without further resistance towards a group of figures waiting near the edge of the crowd. They tossed the thing into a hovering cage, and the crowd refilled around them. The cage slowly pushed away from the stage towards what he could only guess were exits. It dawned on the human then in sudden clarity. They were being auctioned to the highest bidders. Like a commodity, he and these other creatures were being purchased, and for what purpose he did not know. The man tried to shout then, but again no sound came from his scarred throat. Whatever damage had been done was likely permanent, and he realized grimly that he would have to face this in silence. It was decided then that he would listen. There was nothing else one could do but observe and learn when all other means of interaction were stolen. He felt as though his survival would depend on this, and used this new purpose to squash down the fear that was beginning to rush upon him in waves. Those waves crashed harder as the spotlights began to dim out, one after another. The stage darkened as other creatures were sold and transported away. None outmatched the figures that waited for them upon their release from the spheres. Soon it was his turn, and the pod seemed to accelerate forward to the edge of the stage in a strange sensation, like walking forward on an escalator. He heard with clarity the melody of a deep voice which seemed to hum forth quick notes of language unfamiliar. He was going to be sold, and for what purpose he could only imagine. Thoughts of fleeing came to him, but the bonds on his legs kept him from seriously considering it an option. He was truly stuck. He focused onto quieter voices in the distance and tried to squint towards their direction. The melodies seemed to fight from other sides of the crowd with occasional dissonance, and more often than not they interrupted one another. They were most certainly bidding on him. As he tried to peer through the light, he could make out more details. Now, on the very edge of the platform, he found that he could see the first few individuals in the crowd with reliable detail. Again, they reminded him of elves, if elves had long tails and a thin layer of fur. Some few seemed to wear scales around them, many of which glittered and reflected in the light, but most wore slick plastic-like suits around their body and limbs. Their eyes were one solid hue, as if they possessed nothing but an iris, beautiful, but strangely intimidating. The dissonant melodies died suddenly, and his pod lifted off the ground in a sudden leap of speed that had him struggling to remain standing. His legs and arms were still bound by the alien cuffs and made it all but impossible to ready himself. This was especially apparent when the prison touched down in a deceivingly rough fashion. He fell forward and suddenly wisped through the glass as though it had been made of air. Instinctively, he curled in a ball to protect his head, but found that his fall was much slower than expected. With graceful ease, he landed on his feet, despite his cuffs. The creatures around him murmured in quiet, beautiful melodies that he could only guess was astonishment. He, too, stared at the ground in awe, and realized that he felt as though he weighed barely anything. His body was light as a feather here, and every ripple of motion seemed to be magnified because of it. Almost 6 feet tall, the man was not a light individual. Perhaps 25 years of age, it was obvious that he had spent many of those years in physical activity. Fit and large, the human felt used to being heavy, and had grown strength to accommodate for it. Now suddenly it was as if the weight of his very existence had been lifted from him. He didn't know for certain, but he was confident that he had never felt so graceful in his life. That body of dense muscle and weight might as well have been made out of air. The man looked up to see two guards with the shock staffs approaching cautiously. Their tails were raised behind them, and they twitched similar to that of a predator stalking its prey. As the man came to his wits, he tried to walk, but fell, forgetting for an instant that his feet were bound. His grace was lost as quickly as it had been gained, and he fell forward to land on his face. A shock hit his back with searing pain, and his damaged throat tried to scream. The guards had interpreted his action as resistance, and another shock hit him in the side when the first failed to have the desired effect. That agony immediately turned to rage. With seething anger and frustration, the man flexed his muscles to the bursting point and felt something crack. Legs broke their cuffs and sent pieces of the strange material scattering in different directions. Hammering his cuffs down onto his knees, the arm cuffs followed shortly after. The guards had leapt back in shock, and their songs quickened to sharp notes as they began to circle. This was obviously not something that happened often to them, and the crowd that surrounded the three was turning into a milling struggle. Some tried to leave, while others came to watch the show. The human stared at the crowd, and then down the break past them where his assumed purchasers stood. There were three of them, and they seemed uneasy at the moment. It appeared they had gotten more than they bargained for. The crowd had parted even further now as more guards had come rushing to the scene, strange staffs angled and ready. At this point, and there wasn't else within 20 feet in any direction besides the three uneasy purchasers and the guards. He turned towards the ones not pointed weapons at his person. If they had purchased him, they likely didn't want him injured before he served his purpose, whatever that purpose was. Slowly the man walked forward, and the guards seemed to relax. Under their direction, he allowed himself to be led towards the three unarmed beings. Perhaps they could work out some type of understanding. Two were smaller, children perhaps, but one was large enough to stand up to the man's shoulder and wore one of the strange scaled cloaks he had seen scattered about the crowd. It was only slightly smaller than the two guards who held their staffs in an uneasy manner as they circled behind him, but looked more feminine and far more refined. Its posture stood in confidence despite the uneasy movements of its tail, which whipped like a cat's before the pounce. As he reached the three aliens, the two smaller ones seemed to hide behind their elder, shying away from his presence. The man met its solid blue eyes and studied it. Its dark blue eyes peered back, and they did not leave. The strange cloak which wrapped around its shoulders seemed to hide a mane of longer hair which traveled down from its head to the length of its tail, shortening as it went until it blended with the rest of the pale blue hair on its body before its end. It was strangely pretty, and the man found himself begin to relax with the familiarity of its features. This was far safer looking than the previous alien races he had witnessed, and it seemed to push at his memory to bring some type of recognition. A rustle from beneath the scaled cape brought out a silver collar, which the creature slowly reached out with. The man started to raise his hands in front of him to attempt to stop the motion. Whatever that was, it wasn't going on him until he had some answers. Well, he got them pretty quick. Immediately, two shocks hit his ribs from either side, and the collar cracked onto his neck as he fell to his knees. A tingle began to surge from it immediately. In his neck, it seemed spread like stabbing needles deep into his skin as it fused with his body. The man tried to rise, trying desperately to slip his fingers underneath the device and pry it off, but the creature quickly stepped back and raised one of her 6-fingered hands to her opposing wrist. Pain flooded through his entire body. Such unbelievable pain, as if fire was surging through every nerve, every fiber of his being. He fell forward to his knees again, wobbled slowly, and then hit the floor. Darkness took him, and he was thankful that he felt nothing after that.